For almost 3 years, German tank crews lived inside a story they believed was unbreakable. A legend forged in steel, smoke, and blood. It began in August 1942, near Leningrad, when a new machine rolled into combat for the first time. The Tiger I. From the moment its tracks touched the battlefield, it seemed to rewrite the rules of armored warfare. Soldiers on both sides quickly realized this was not just another tank. It was something different, something terrifying. The Tiger's 88mm gun could strike enemy armor from distances Allied crews could barely imagine. In ideal conditions, it could punch through opposing tanks from nearly 2 kilometers away. At those ranges, enemy vehicles weren't even shapes anymore, just dark specks on the horizon. And while real combat rarely allowed such extreme shots, the message was clear. The Tiger could kill long before most enemies could even respond. Its armor was just as imposing. The front of the turret measured around 100 millimeters thick, with reinforced sections near the gun mantlet reaching closer to 120. At normal battlefield ranges, most Allied tank guns simply couldn't get through. The math was brutal, and every crew understood it. An American M4 Sherman, armed with a 75mm gun, could only penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at roughly 100 to 200 meters. Even then, success wasn't guaranteed. Meanwhile, a Tiger could destroy a Sherman head on from 10 times that distance. German crews didn't need advanced calculations to understand what that meant. In a straight fight, they held all the cards. Terrain, artillery, and air power often limited that advantage. Tigers couldn't always dominate the battlefield the way the numbers suggested. But even when the advantage was theoretical, its psychological weight was very real. By late 1944, the Tiger was no longer the unstoppable force it once seemed. Allied guns were improving. Tank destroyers were becoming more effective. Air power ruled the skies. Yet the myth survived. In the right position, a single Tiger could still slow an entire Allied advance. And sometimes, belief mattered more than reality. Allied tank crews developed a condition they jokingly called Tiger fever. In the chaos of combat, every German tank looked like a tiger. Every ambush felt like an encounter with an invincible monster. Reports flooded command posts claiming Tigers everywhere, far more than actually existed. On the German side, the effect was the opposite. Heavy tank crews began to believe in their own invulnerability. Kill rings were painted proudly on gun barrels, like fighter pilots marking victories. Veterans of heavy battalions later described the feeling as almost mystical. Wrapped in thick armor and wielding a devastating gun, many crews felt untouchable. That confidence wasn't entirely irrational, but it was incomplete. German doctrine never relied on Tigers alone. Heavy tanks were meant to support layered defenses built around anti-tank guns, carefully chosen terrain, and overlapping fields of fire. Tigers were positioned to exploit range, striking at maximum distance where their advantage was greatest. Even as German forces retreated across France and into the Low Countries in late 1944, even as fuel ran short and spare parts disappeared, Tiger crews held onto one belief. They might be outnumbered 10 to 1, even 20 to 1, but they had the better machines. Quality would defeat quantity. It always had. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that nearly 8,000 kilometers away, across the Atlantic, that assumption was quietly dying. Since 1942, deep inside America's industrial heartland, engineers had been working on a new kind of tank. A response to battlefield reports. A machine designed not just to survive against German heavy armor, but to defeat it. Factories in Michigan and beyond were retooling. Designers were abandoning old limitations. A powerful new gun, once reserved for anti-aircraft use, was being adapted for tank combat. Armor layouts were being reconsidered, transmissions redesigned, turrets reshaped. The result of that effort would eventually be known as the M26 Pershing. At first, German commanders had no idea it existed. American industry. Often dismissed as crude and unsophisticated by German planners, was doing something they believed impossible. It wasn't choosing quantity over quality. It was building both, at the same time. And when the Pershing finally arrived in Europe in early 1945, it didn't announce itself with parades or propaganda. It moved quietly, hidden among Shermans, disguised by familiarity. German tank crews still believed they understood their enemy. They were wrong. The myth that had protected them for years was about to collide with reality. On the streets of a ruined German city, in the span of seconds, under the echo of a single gunshot. And once that happened, nothing would ever feel the same again. The road to the Pershing did not begin with triumph. It began with frustration. American tank designers had to confront an uncomfortable truth. The M4 Sherman, the backbone of U.S. armored forces, had never been intended to fight monsters like the Tiger. When it was designed in 1941, its primary opponent was expected to be the Panzer IV, still armed at that time with a short-barreled 75mm gun. Against that threat, the Sherman was adequate, reliable, easy to produce, easy to repair. But war does not freeze in time. When American crews first encountered Tigers and Panthers in Italy and Normandy, the imbalance was obvious. German tanks had thicker armor, more powerful guns, and longer effective range. Sherman crews fought bravely, often compensating with teamwork, artillery support, and sheer numbers, but the reports coming back from the front were impossible to ignore. Something had to change. By late 1942, officers in the U.S. Ordnance Department began planning a new tank armed with a 90mm gun. Not an incremental upgrade, a fundamental shift. In 1943, those plans evolved into the T-25 and T-26 projects, vehicles specifically designed to challenge Germany's heavy armor head-on. This was not a small undertaking. Unlike Germany, which often designed tanks first and worried about production later, the United States had to ensure that any new design could be built at scale. The project spread across multiple automotive plants, subcontractors, and thousands of workers in several states. These were people already producing Shermans, half-tracks, engines, and aircraft components at an extraordinary pace. Now they were being asked to do more. The Fisher Body Division of General Motors, which built Shermans in Michigan, was ordered to retool for the new tank. That meant new turret castings, new hull designs, new transmission systems, and the integration of a gun unlike anything previously mounted in an American tank. The 90mm M3 gun represented a major leap forward. It fired a 24-pound armor-piercing shell at more than 800 feet per second. Test data showed that the standard M82 round could penetrate roughly 150 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. The high-velocity HVEP round, with its tungsten core, could punch through well over 250 millimeters at the same distance. On paper, this meant something extraordinary. For the first time, an American tank gun could reliably threaten Tigers and even King Tigers. If the crew could land a good hit. Security around the project was tight. Many factory workers only knew they were building a heavier vehicle related to the Sherman family. Parts were manufactured at multiple plants, as was standard for wartime production, but secrecy focused on how the new tank would be deployed and introduced into combat. That moment came in January 1945. 20 T-26E3 Pershings were quietly shipped from the United States to Europe under a program known as the Zebra Mission. Crews trained at Fort Knox were instructed to refer to the tanks simply as new Shermans. Even the men escorting them across the Atlantic understood that they were guarding something unusual. The voyage to Antwerp passed through waters still haunted by German U-boats. When the Pershings finally reached Europe later that month, they were handed over to the 1st U.S. Army and split between the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions operating near the Roer River. By the time the first Pershings reached frontline units in late February 1945, American factories had already built more than 200 of them. Production was accelerating. By the end of the year, total output would reach roughly 200 tanks. Germany, by comparison, had built just over 300 Tiger I tanks and fewer than 500 King Tigers during the entire war. But German commanders didn't know this. From their perspective, nothing fundamental had changed. American doctrine still appeared to favor mass production of medium tanks. Intelligence reports offered no clear warning of a new American heavy tank entering service. Recognition manuals still focused on Shermans and other familiar vehicles. This was a catastrophic blind spot. German planners had convinced themselves that the United States lacked the technical sophistication to field truly advanced armored vehicles. They believed American industry could only produce simple, standardized designs in large numbers. The idea that the U.S. could pivot to heavy tank production while maintaining its massive output of ships, aircraft, trucks, and existing tanks seemed absurd to them. It was exactly the kind of assumption that gets armies destroyed. The 3rd Armored Division began deploying its Pershings around February 25, 1945. To test them under real combat conditions, commanders mixed 1 Pershing into each Sherman company. The tanks were painted in standard olive drab, marked like any other vehicle, meant to blend in rather than stand out. But to trained eyes, they were unmistakable. A longer gun, a lower profile, a different presence. Crews received strict instructions. Avoid combat unless engaging German heavy tanks. Preserve secrecy as long as possible. The goal was not immediate dominance, but surprise. That secrecy didn't last long. On February 26, near the town of Elsdorf, the 1st Pershing was knocked out in combat. The tank, nicknamed Fireball, was ambushed at close range by a Tiger I. An 88mm round struck the Pershing's gun mantlet, killing the gunner and loader instantly. For German crews, this should have confirmed everything they believed. But it didn't. Fireball was recovered, repaired, and returned to service by March 7. In the final months of the war, Germany no longer had the logistical capacity to perform recoveries like that. Tanks lost were often gone forever. The fact that the Americans could pull a knocked-out heavy tank off the battlefield and have it fighting again within days was itself a warning sign. In the days that followed, German crews began encountering American tanks that didn't behave the way Shermans were supposed to behave. At certain ranges, these vehicles could penetrate armor more easily. They absorbed hits that should have been lethal. Some crews dismissed it. Smoke. Poor angles. Bad luck. Others began to worry. There were no clear intelligence bulletins, no updated manuals, no recognition charts explaining what they were seeing. Years of combat experience told them American tanks were inferior. Training reinforced it. Doctrine assumed it. Then came Cologne. By March 1945, Germany was collapsing from every direction. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. Artillery pounded supply routes into dust. Fuel was scarce. Spare parts were scarcer. But inside their tanks, many German crews still believed in one final advantage. When combat narrowed to steel versus steel, when air power and artillery fell silent for a moment, they still trusted their armor and their guns. That belief followed Panzer Brigade 106 into the ruins of Cologne. On the afternoon of March 6, 1945, Panther tanks took up positions around Cologne Cathedral Square. Rubble from shattered buildings provided hull-down cover. The wide, open space offered long sightlines. It was exactly the kind of ground German tank doctrine favored. Wilhelm Bartelborth commanded one of those Panthers. Like many veteran tank commanders, Bartelborth had survived years of retreat and attrition. He understood the strengths of his machine and the habits of his enemy. American tanks, he believed, were predictable, dangerous in numbers, but individually outmatched. At approximately 3:20 p.m., movement caught his attention near the ruins of the Geryon Hotel. Through his periscope, Bartelborth identified an approaching American tank. It appeared to be a Sherman variant, though the gun looked unusually long. The range was about 300 meters. For a Panther, that was almost point blank. Doctrine was clear: fire first, fire decisively. Bartelborth ordered his gunner to engage. The Panther's 75mm round crossed the distance in a heartbeat and slammed into the American tank's frontal armor. The crew braced for the familiar result. Penetration. Fire. Another kill added to the tally. Instead, sparks exploded outward. The shell ricocheted. Inside the Panther, there was a brief moment of disbelief. Armor that should have failed had held. Before anyone could fully process what that meant, the return shot arrived. The American tank was a Pershing. Staff Sergeant Robert Early commanded the vehicle his crew had named Eagle 7. His gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, already had the Panther centered in his sight. When the German round bounced harmlessly off their armor, Smoyer knew they had the advantage. He fired once. The Pershing's 90mm shell tore through the Panther's turret face, as if it wasn't there. Inside the German tank, ammunition detonated almost instantly. Flames erupted. The crew had no chance to escape. From first shot to destruction, the engagement lasted less than 15 seconds. Signal Corps cameraman Jim Bates captured the entire fight on film. The footage would later become some of the most famous combat recordings of the war, not because of its length, but because of what it revealed. Moments later, another German tank moved to engage Eagle 7. Accounts differ on whether it was another Panther or a Tiger, but the result was the same. One shot. Total destruction. The entire engagement lasted under 5 minutes. 5 minutes that shattered a myth. Across the square, Feldwebel Karl Hoffmann watched Bartelborth's Panther burn. Through a damaged periscope, he saw the flames consume the tank. He knew the men inside. Had trained with them. Shared meals with them during the long retreat from France. Now they were dead. Hoffmann studied the American tank that had done it. The gun was wrong. Too large for a Sherman. The way it absorbed the first hit was wrong. Everything about the engagement violated what he understood about American armor. In that moment, Hoffmann made a decision that would have been unthinkable months earlier. He ordered his crew to withdraw. That evening, surviving crews from Panzer Brigade 106 filed their reports. They described an American tank with a heavy gun, estimated around 90mm, and frontal armor capable of deflecting Panther rounds at close range. Whether those reports reached higher headquarters intact is unclear. If they did, they were lost among hundreds of other messages flooding in during the chaotic final months of the war. For years, German officers had believed American tanks were weaker than Tigers and Panthers. Training manuals said so. Experience reinforced it. That long habit of thinking made it difficult to accept the reality unfolding in front of them. But Cologne was not an isolated incident. Within hours, similar reports began arriving from other sectors. Commands issued instructions that reflected real uncertainty. Any encounter with unknown American heavy tanks was to be reported immediately. Detailed descriptions were required. Capabilities assessed. Information forwarded without delay. The responses painted a consistent picture. American tanks with guns in the 90mm class. Frontal armor that resisted Panther fire. Vehicles capable of destroying German heavy tanks at normal combat ranges. This wasn't panic. It wasn't imagination. It was real. Some crews initially mistook Pershings for unusual Sherman variants, especially at long range or in poor visibility. Recognition materials offered no guidance. Manuals assumed American tank guns could not penetrate German heavy armor frontally. That assumption was now demonstrably false. By mid-March 1945, roughly 20 Pershings were operational in the European theater, with more arriving each week. 20 tanks among thousands of Shermans might seem insignificant, but their psychological impact was anything but. Every engagement became a gamble. Was that approaching tank a Sherman? dangerous but manageable? Or was it a Pershing, capable of killing them before they could respond? There was no way to know until the shooting started. And by then, it was often too late. By the spring of 1945, the war in Western Europe was no longer decided by brilliant maneuvers or daring counterattacks. It was being decided by exhaustion, by shortages, by the slow, grinding realization that there was no path left to victory. For German armored forces, that realization cut especially deep. For years, tank crews had endured retreat after retreat by clinging to one belief: their machines were still superior. Even when outnumbered. Even when fuel was scarce. Even when Allied aircraft ruled the skies. Their tanks, they believed, gave them a fighting chance. The arrival of the Pershing didn't destroy that belief on its own. But it cracked it. And once cracked, it spread. Reports circulated through Panzer training schools and unit headquarters describing an American heavy tank with thick frontal armor, a powerful gun, and unexpected attention to crew protection. These weren't just battlefield rumors. They were technical assessments, observations made by professionals who knew armor, ballistics, and combat conditions. The Pershing's large cast turret showed a production approach the Germans understood, even if they preferred welded construction. Its Ford GA V8 engine produced 500 horsepower with a level of reliability German crews could only envy. Even late in the war, German engines struggled with breakdowns that American crews increasingly took for granted as problems already solved. The Pershing's transmission featured advanced systems that looked impossibly complex on paper, yet functioned smoothly in the field. Its power traverse could rotate the massive turret a full 360 degrees in about 15 seconds. The stabilizer wasn't perfect and many crews turned it off. But it represented another area where American designers were experimenting rather than standing still. Then, there were the details that hit hardest. Wet ammunition stowage designed to reduce catastrophic fires, improved internal layout, better crew ergonomics, small comfort features like padding and interior lighting. These weren't luxuries. They were signs of a design philosophy that valued crew survival. German tanks had sacrificed those considerations in pursuit of maximum armor and firepower. Now German crews were facing an enemy who had achieved comparable firepower without making the same sacrifices. That realization hurt more than any penetration chart. The numbers made it worse. By early 1945, Germany was producing only a fraction of the armored vehicles it had built at its peak. Allied bombing, fuel shortages, loss of skilled labor, and collapsing supply networks had crippled output. Over the entire war, Germany produced about 350 Tiger I tanks and roughly 490 King Tigers. In less than a year, American factories built more than 200 Pershings. And that production happened while the United States continued to manufacture thousands of Shermans, aircraft, ships, trucks, artillery pieces, and every other component of modern industrial warfare. Plants like the Detroit Arsenal tank plant covered more than 100 acres and could turn out armored vehicles at a scale Germany simply could not match. German tankers already knew American industry could replace losses faster than Germany. That knowledge weighed heavily on morale. Learning that the United States could also field a new heavy tank pushed that weight from discouraging to crushing. It wasn't just that the enemy had better numbers. It was that the enemy had caught up technologically and might even be pulling ahead. That belief spread quietly but relentlessly through the Panzerwaffe. Crews began abandoning tanks over minor mechanical issues. Vehicles that could have been repaired weeks earlier were left behind because fuel was gone or air attacks made recovery impossible. Defensive positions that should have held for days collapsed in hours. The material impact of 20 Pershings was minimal. The psychological impact was devastating. Every unidentified American tank became a question mark: Sherman or Pershing? Medium tank or heavy killer? The uncertainty alone altered behavior. Crews hesitated. Commanders withdrew earlier. Engagements ended before they fully began. The Battle of Dessau in late April 1945 showed how far things had shifted. German defenders still had Panthers and at least one heavy tank. Resistance was real, but it lacked the stubborn defiance seen earlier in the war. Fuel shortages, air attacks, and overwhelming Allied numbers made every stand feel temporary. Veteran units that had once considered themselves elite, formations hardened on the Eastern Front, were often the most shocked when facing Western Allied forces. They had expected to dominate American armor the way they had fought Soviet tanks. Instead, they encountered an enemy who combined numbers, air power, logistics, and now increasingly capable armored vehicles. Confusion did exist. In the chaos of 1945, some German reports mentioned American heavy tanks where only Shermans were present. But this confusion was a symptom, not a cause. The Panzer force was collapsing primarily because Germany's strategic position had collapsed. By the final weeks of the war, many German soldiers actively sought surrender to Western Allied forces. Fear of Soviet captivity played a major role. So did the recognition that the war was already lost. New American tanks like the Pershing reinforced that belief, but they didn't create it. After the war, German veterans often spoke less about specific enemy tanks and more about Allied air power, artillery, and logistics. Some mentioned better, armed American tanks as part of a larger pattern. The sense that the enemy's strength kept growing while Germany's resources vanished. There is a bitter irony here. Even as German tank crews lost faith in their technological edge, German engineers were still designing advanced vehicles. Panther IIA, the E-series standardized tanks. Promising designs filled notebooks and prototype halls. But Germany no longer had the resources to turn ideas into machines. The contrast was stark. German doctrine chased technical perfection, refining designs again and again, even as production faltered. American doctrine pursued sufficient quality at overwhelming scale. The Pershing represented the moment those two paths crossed, and one clearly won. The Pershing itself was not flawless. Its transmission would prove troublesome even after the war. Its rate of fire was slower than the German 88. Its armor, while effective, was thinner in places than a King Tiger's massive plates. But perfection wasn't the point. The Pershing shattered assumptions. It proved that American industry could innovate, adapt, and produce at the same time. That mattered more than any single engagement or kill count. Today, surviving Pershings stand in museums beside captured German heavy tanks. Armor thickness and gun calibers are listed on placards. But those statistics can't capture what German crews felt in 1945. The moment they realized the certainty they had relied on was gone. The understanding that the war wasn't being lost on the battlefield alone, but in factories thousands of miles away, in places like Detroit and Grand Blanc, where workers built machines faster than Germany could destroy them. The myth didn't die all at once. It burned. Slowly, relentlessly, and by the time it was gone, the war was already over. By the time the war in Europe ended, the Pershing had not rewritten history through overwhelming battlefield victories. It did something quieter, and in many ways more powerful. It changed what German tank crews believed was possible. Only about 20 Pershings reached actual combat before Germany surrendered. Roughly 300 were shipped to Europe, and around 200 were issued to frontline units in some capacity. In raw numbers, that was insignificant compared to the thousands of Shermans rolling across Western Europe. But numbers alone never tell the whole story. By October 1945, American factories had produced a little over 200 Pershings. Most were completed too late to fight, but their existence told a larger truth. The United States had built the capability to outproduce German heavy tank manufacturing while simultaneously producing medium tanks, aircraft, ships, trucks, and every other tool of modern war, Germany across the entire conflict produced about 347 Tiger I tanks and 492 King Tigers. The gap was not just industrial. It was philosophical. German tank crews had been taught that technical excellence could compensate for being outnumbered. That superior machines, operated by skilled crews, could overcome almost any disadvantage. For a time, that belief had been justified. The Pershing didn't defeat Germany on its own. Allied air power, artillery, logistics, and manpower had already tipped the balance. But the Pershing delivered proof. Proof that American engineering had caught up. Proof that the advantage German crews depended on was gone. On March 6, 1945, in Cologne Cathedral Square, that proof arrived in seconds. A Panther fired first. The shot bounced. Moments later, a 90mm American round ended the fight, and with it, a belief that had sustained German armored forces for years. That moment was repeated in different forms across the Western Front. Sometimes in direct combat, sometimes in reports, sometimes only as rumor. But once German crews understood that American heavy tanks existed, uncertainty replaced confidence. And uncertainty kills faster than steel. The Pershing stands today as more than a vehicle. It is a symbol of what happens when industrial capacity, innovation, and national will align. It represents the ability of a democratic society to adapt under pressure and to match, and eventually exceed, the capabilities of an enemy that once seemed unbeatable. Not because of one tank, but because of millions of workers, engineers, soldiers, and families pulling in the same direction. If this story moved you, challenged what you thought you knew, or helped you see World War II from a new perspective, consider subscribing to the channel. We tell stories about the people, machines, and moments that changed history. Not with hype, but with depth and respect. Hit the like button if you found value here. It helps more than you realize. And let us know in the comments, do you think psychological impact matters more than raw firepower in war? Or was the Pershing simply a symbol of forces that had already decided the outcome?